Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this second webinar looking at our approaches to carbon management. This is a public policy projects report that is kindly being sponsored by Third Way. And in this second webinar, we're taking a look at the international approaches to carbon capture and carbon removals. We're delighted to be joined by representatives of three continents from across the globe. We have Brad Crabtree, who is the Assistant Secretary for Fossil Energy and Carbon Management at the UK Department of Energy. We have Mr. Bong Yong Yong, who is the Director of Ccu Association, which is a leading sort of a private sector cross-departmental organization looking at providing CCUS development in South Korea, an alliance between the Ministry of Trade, Industry and Energy, research organizations and the private sector. And finally, from the European Union, Emilian Gask, climate attaché at the EU delegation to the UK. And by way of format for our sessions, we have the speakers who will give their presentations. Brad Crabtree will go first, and he's got a slide presentation to give. And we will be listening to these presentations, which will be sort of public. And then we will then be going offline to have discussions amongst the commissioners with some of our speakers who are able to remain to answer some questions on the basis of their remarks. So while this is a public-facing seminar to start with, we will then be going sort of private so that we can have some discussion, particularly amongst the commissioners who are on this report. I'm delighted, obviously, to be co-chairing this with John Gibbons, the Professor of CCS at the University of Sheffield, and Professor Niall McDowell, Professor in Energy Systems Engineering at Imperial College London. So I'm going to turn now to Brad, if that's okay, to open up the discussion from the sort of what is happening in the US when it comes to carbon removals, carbon capture, and the plans for the future. So over to you, Brad. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Chris, and good afternoon to everyone in the UK. It's great to be with all of you and also my colleague from Korea as well. A special thanks to Rudra Kapila at Third Way as well for reaching out to me to participate in this event. If we could turn to the first slide. Excellent, thank you. Perfect. So, and then I guess just go ahead and go to the next slide. And I'll start by just, before I get into the details, just say a little bit about the Office of Fossil Energy and Carbon Management at the Department of Energy. We have in our portfolio three pillars that are really critical, both for a clean energy economy and meeting our climate obligations, but also in terms of responding to the challenge that's been created by the Russian invasion of Ukraine. We are responsible for all things carbon management, the entire value chain, so carbon capture, carbon removal, things like direct air capture, conversion of captured carbon emissions into valuable products, the development of CO2 transport infrastructure, and finally, the development of secure geologic storage sites for that captured carbon. In addition, we have programs and authorities in the realm of natural gas, including the export of liquefied natural gas. So at this time of the war in Ukraine and the global energy crisis, this part of our portfolio has really expanded. And then finally, critical minerals. Making sure that the United States and our allies have access to the critical minerals that we need to build a clean energy and industrial economy. So that's just a little bit of the backdrop. We have both an annual budget, which I'll talk about right now, and then we have an appropriated budget for the US national infrastructure legislation, which I'll refer to as the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. that passed last year, and I'll talk about that in a moment. Our current annual budget is what you see on the screen there. And I'm going to talk today just about the carbon management component of this because of its relevance to this session. Carbon capture is at $163 million, and that is a whole range of technologies, both technologies that are now commercial as well as those that are emerging. CO2 transport and storage in the United States context, different from Europe. It's principally CO2 pipelines, but we are also looking at what's happening in Europe and looking at maritime transport of CO2 and also exploring rail transport in the United States. Carbon dioxide removal, and it's the whole range of carbon dioxide removal strategies, including direct air capture, but certainly not limited to direct air capture. Carbon dioxide conversion at $50 million. That is the area that is most nascent along with carbon dioxide removal, but growing. And we're looking at a host of technology pathways for utilizing captured carbon emissions. And then finally, we don't have principal responsibility for hydrogen, but where it involves the use of natural gas or other fossil fuels with carbon capture, that falls under fossil energy and carbon management at the Department of Energy. Next slide. So last year, there were very important legislation in the United States passed, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. It was the most significant infrastructure legislation in US history. In the context of carbon management and what we're talking about today, it was the culmination of years of legislative activity. And I'm going to walk through just a few of the programs that resulted from this legislation. But there's over $12 billion over 5 years that will be invested in carbon management. That is the largest national investment in carbon management in the world today. I would note, though, I was in Norway a couple of weeks ago meeting with the Norwegian government, and their investment in the Northern Lights project is a little over $2 billion, which on a per capita basis is roughly $140 billion. So I think we do need to put that investment in a bit of context. So I had mentioned CO2 transport and storage. That there's a $2 billion that's not listed here to develop a CO2 infrastructure financing program that will be at a different office at the Department of Energy, and that will be leveraged with private sector money, potentially up to close to $20 billion with the private sector dollars investing in CO2 transport infrastructure. Our office will be supporting the FEED studies, the engineering studies to develop those regional CO2 transport projects. The legislation also enables a truly dramatic scaling up of geologic storage. Like in Europe, we have decades of experience of storing CO2 geologically safely at scale, both in oil and gas formations, but also in saline geologic formations. But we do not have adequate geographic diversity in terms of those storage options, and that's limiting the possibility of carbon capture deployment. So there's $2.5 billion in the infrastructure bill over a 5-year period to develop regional saline geologic storage sites that will serve multiple carbon capture projects on a regional basis. It also, I mentioned carbon utilization before. We have the $50 million annual budget. This effectively doubles that budget over the next 5 years. And then finally, on carbon dioxide removal, there's a major investment in the development of regional direct air capture hubs. Each one of the hubs will capture and store from ambient air 1 million tons of CO2 per year or more. That could be accomplished by one or multiple technologies. If it's one technology in a modular form, it needs to be at least 50,000 tons per year per unit, but collectively achieving 1 million tons in the hub. I'll talk about hubs in a little bit more, but the regional direct air capture hubs is one example of a broader approach to hub development. We also have hydrogen hubs, 4 of them in the infrastructure bill as well, an $8 billion investment One of those 4 hubs will be using carbon capture from natural gas to produce the clean hydrogen, but it's a demonstration of capture, transport, storage, and end use of clean hydrogen. I should probably go to the next slide here. I mentioned the hydrogen hubs, and the other thing that this legislation does. I've been involved in carbon management for 20 years prior to joining the Department of Energy, and one of the recurring themes over those 20 years, both in the United States and in Europe, was the need to expand research and development to supporting early commercial demonstration of technologies. And at least in a US context, we finally broke through with the infrastructure bill to formally bring in large-scale commercial demonstration of technology to be part of our R&D program. And one of the responses of the Department of Energy is to stand up what's called the Office of Clean Energy Demonstrations. And so across all the various offices at DOE, including carbon management, those projects that we would have traditionally worked on in our area of responsibility that are on commercial scale will now be implemented by the Office of Clean Energy Demonstrations. And this includes a $2.5 billion investment in what will be 6 commercial scale demonstrations of carbon capture technology. 2 will be on existing coal-fired power plants, 2 will be on natural gas-fired power plants, and 2 will be on industrial facilities at commercial scale. So things like cement, steel, basic chemicals, and so forth. We already have 12 commercial scale carbon capture projects operating in the United States today. But most of those are in sectors that already produce fairly concentrated streams of CO2. This will bring that commercial deployment more into areas like power generation and heavy industry, where you have streams of CO2 at lower concentrations that are more challenging and costly to capture and manage. I had mentioned also then the other billion of that 3.5 billion is to support large scale pilot projects, so not quite fully commercial demonstrations. What's exciting about that $1 billion is it's not limited to technology or industry. So we have a lot of discretion in thinking through what are the R&D and demonstration needs, especially in the industrial sector. And then I mentioned the CO2 transport financing program. Next slide. So on policy, obviously this $12 billion investment in carbon management is very significant. We look at it as a once in a generation opportunity in our country to have an impact on the trajectory of technology development and deployment. There is also a discussion that has been going on for months in Congress about a broader tax credit package, both clean energy and industrial tax credit package. We actually might get news this week. We're certainly anticipating probably this month or early August on this package. It, in the area of carbon management, it would further expand the existing federal 45Q tax credit in the United States. That's a tax credit that provides an incentive for carbon capture, carbon utilization, and direct air capture projects that in the case of carbon capture and direct air capture, storing their CO2 in geologic formations. Right now, that tax credit provides $50 US per ton of CO2 geologically stored. And then if you're storing that's in a saline geologic formation. If you're storing the CO2 through enhanced oil recovery, it's $35. On the table right now would be enhancements that would take the value of that tax credit to $180 per ton for direct air capture projects storing CO2 in saline formations, and $85 a ton for electric power and industry. These would be really transformative levels for the credit. And the way we're looking at this is if Congress enacts this tax credit package, that would really leverage the federal investments that we'll be making in the infrastructure bill. So the other thing that the tax credit package would do would be to extend the tax credits for a period of 10 years. So between now and 2032, any project beginning construction would be eligible to claim that tax credit for 12 years. So that would give a real runway for project development, investment, and construction. Next slide. Let me just say one more thing, just to give you a sense of scale here. And obviously, this is not analysis from the Department of Energy. I just want to underscore this. But colleagues at the Clean Air Task Force, a national and international NGO, commissioned the Rhodium Group to take a look at what the provisions in the infrastructure bill on carbon management that are already in law and already being implemented, together with this tax credit package, if Congress moves forward, what would be the result of that from a deployment standpoint? And they estimate that by 2035, we could have 210 to 250 million tons of annual CO2 capture and storage in the United States, again, by 2035, if we had the combination of both those federal investments in projects coupled with the enhanced tax incentive. Finally, the priority of the infrastructure bill is not just climate. It is also what are the impacts, the implications of these investments in real communities around the United States. And as elsewhere in the world, we have communities that have been on the front lines of energy and industrial development for generations that have borne the brunt of traditional pollution, not just greenhouse gas emissions. And the Biden administration has made a real commitment not only to meeting our climate goals of net zero by 2050 and zero emissions in the power sector by 2035, but making sure that a significant portion, 40% of the investments from the infrastructure bill, go to disadvantaged communities. And in the context of carbon management, that will be focused on communities that are proximate to these major facilities that would be retrofitted. And so we're really trying to make sure that not only are we meeting our climate obligations, but we are taking real measurable action to reduce traditional pollutants in communities, but also to make sure that these communities have access to workforce development, job training, and other opportunities so that they have the skill sets to take advantage of some of the high wage jobs that will be created by these many projects funded under the infrastructure bill. I think that was my last slide. Yes, I should probably end there. I suspect I'm close to 10 minutes.
Well, Brad, thank you so much for that overview. And yeah, really appreciate going into detail on what the infrastructure bill means and its progress. And I should say to audience members, if you have questions, on any of the presentations, please do put them into the chat function, and I will sort of pick them up later as chair and try to group them thematically. I'm now going to turn now to Mr. Bongyong Yong, as I mentioned, director of the KCCUS Association in South Korea. Obviously, South Korea is one of the three countries, along with Canada and the UK, that has included CCUS in its 2030 NDC, having a clear commitment towards a goal. And we're delighted to be able to hear about the progress that's being made in the particular country and also internationally. South Korea, I recognise, it is looking to expand its innovation and technology abroad also. So, Mr. Yong, thank you very much.
Okay. Okay. Good afternoon. I am Bongyong Jung, director at the Korea CCUS Association. We are Korea's leading organization for CCUS promotion and commercialization. Professor Kwon, the Director General of the KCCUS Association, had an urgent meeting with the government and could not come to today's webinar. In his place, I will be presenting about Korea's CCUS related policies status of technical development, and CCUS demonstration plan. We apologize for the change in schedule. Okay, let me begin. This is the contents of my presentations. In October 2020, the Korean government announced Korea's ambitions to achieve carbon neutrality by 2050. Korea considers CCUS technology an essential tool to achieve both Korea's 2030 NDC and 2050 carbon neutrality pledge. Specifically, by 2030, Korea aims to reduce emissions by 10.3 million tons through CCUS. As of October 2021, both scenarios used by Korea to determine net zero pathways contain an important role for CCUS. In scenario A, which forecasts an earlier end to thermal power generation, CCUS will help avoid over 55 million tons of CO2 emission annually. In scenario B, where LNG power generation is still expected in Korea, CCUS will be needed at a greater scale, preventing almost 85 million tons of CO2. As such, Korea is committed to accelerating the development and demonstration of CCUS technology. Korea enacted the Carbon Neutrality and Green Growth in Response to Climate Change Framework Act in September 2021. This makes Korea the 14th nation in the world to legislate a vision and plan for 2050 carbon neutrality. This Framework Act sets out the vision, pathway, and concrete actions needed to transition to a carbon neutral society. The actions are on the figure on the right. For example, one action is the establishment of the National 2050 Carbon Neutrality Vision Statement. Please refer to the figure for more. Another feature of Korea's approach to decarbonization is the National Green Growth Strategy. It is renewed every 5 years. The current Green Growth Plan from 2019 to 2023 contains 5 major policy streams displayed on the slide. Regarding CCUS, the seeks to advance CCUS technological development and demonstration. The key focus points are continuous demonstration of CCUS technology, strengthen efforts to secure offshore CO2 storage, and promoting development for CO2 utilization. And in 2050, carbon neutral strategy, the key strategy for CCUS technical development is as follows. Technological advancements and cost reduction, large capacity storage facilities and their social acceptance, and market-based incentives balanced with regulatory approaches. Demonstrations are key to the 2050 carbon neutrality strategy, which offer technological learnings and proof that CCS can work. Our plan for demonstrations are detailed on the next slide. Demonstration projects are critical to learning and improving the large-scale deployment of CCUS. Korea's integrated CCS demonstration promotion plan is therefore critical for advancing Korea's CCUS ambitions. As you can see on the slide, the demonstration promotion plan is made up of Phase 1, Phase 2, and Phase 3, increasingly large-scale CCS projects. These plans adopt a hub model to make transporting CO2 economical and will store it safely and in offshore depleted gas field and saline aquifers. Korea also has a CCU roadmap. It is for the long-term strategy of technological progress and commercialization of CCU. In 3 stages, the roadmap shows a plan for achieving a new CCU economy. By 2025, it seeks to achieve technological competitiveness through technical improvements and innovation for CCU-based products. By 2030, it aims to form an initial CCU product market and achieve the commercialization of CCU technologies. And finally, the roadmap set a goal of cost competitiveness by 2040. The flagship project in Korea's CCUS R&D program is the East Sea CCS demonstration project. This project would collect carbon captured from industrial sources in Ulsan. After capture, the CO2 would be transported to a hub terminal for processing. The CO2 stream would then be injected into the depleted gas reservoir of the East Sea. The project is expected to inject 400,000 tons of CO2 per year and demonstrate the feasibility, safety, and efficiency of CCS at a mid-scale level in Korea. The East Sea CCS demonstration project is hopefully the first of many CCS demonstration projects in the future. Now, to another major project related to policy, the creation of an integrated CCUS bill. Korea needs to have the right policy settings so that unnecessary barriers to CCUS are removed and deployment can be accelerated. Korea has been working to reform various complex pieces of legislation that can apply to CCUS projects. Our aim is to enact a single integrated CCUS policy. The policy will be comprehensive and streamline all aspects of the CCUS value chain. For example, we will seek to revise the legal concept of CO2 from a waste to a recycled resource or material. In February, KCCUS held consultations with the Korean private sector, civil society, and NGO stakeholders. Using their input, we are preparing a ministerial proposal that will coordinate amongst all relevant ministries to ensure cohesion. From June, our objective is to seek enactment of the bill through the National Assembly. This deadline is short. This shows that we are serious about passing the bill, as this will accelerate the deployments of CCUS in Korea. We believe that international collaboration will be essential to achieve our vision, commercially ready CCUS in Korea. As an example, we see potential in constructive partnerships that will lead to technical innovation, cost reduction, and better efficiency. One example is KCCU's recent partnership with CO2CRC, a leading Australian CCUS research institute. We hope to pursue large-scale international CCUS projects, including joint feasibility research on large-scale offshore CCS. In this spirit, I'm grateful for the opportunity to speak with you today. To conclude, here is the map with the countries that Korea is collaborating with on CCUS. Unfortunately, I have to leave right now. I apologize for the change in plans with our Director General, Professor Wang.
Mr. Young, thank you so much.
Okay, one more page. If you have any questions, please message us at the emails here. We look forward to continue talking about collaborating in CCS and emissions reduction. Thank you very much.
Mr. Yong, thank you so much for stepping in today and giving sort of the views not only of South Korea, but also of KKCOS. Is deeply appreciated, and obviously with the time difference, I'm incredibly grateful for your participation. And we'll probably note the email addresses, and if there's any additional queries, we'll be in contact. But thank you so much for your time. I'm now going to turn to our next speaker. I'm grateful to be joined by Emilian Gasp, who is the climate attaché at the EU delegation for the UK. Maybe some of you in the audience will recognise Emilian. He's a constant feature when it comes to being representing the EU on the UK environment and climate scene, and we're deeply grateful for his time today in terms of setting out sort of wider approaches that the EU is taking on carbon management and carbon removal for the future. So Emilian, could I hand over to you, please?
Thank you very much, Chris, and thank you to PPP and Third Way for the opportunity. Indeed, I'm Emilian Gasp, the Climate Environment Attaché at the EU delegation to the UK. And as such, I should mention from the get-go that I do not have the same level of expertise, of course, as the previous speakers on CCS, but I'll be happy to give you a sense of where we are in the EU. And of course, I'm always happy to connect you directly to experts in Brussels if you have more questions. Rachel should have my presentation, so thank you very much. Now, what I'll try to do in this presentation is, of course, tell you where we are, including a couple of announcements by the Commission last week and this very morning, so it's a timely event. But I suppose what I will try to do really is to address an apparent contradiction. And that contradiction has two legs. On the one hand, it's the sense that for some that the EU may be not as enthusiastic about CCS and some forms of carbon removals as others. And the other leg of the contradiction is that, well, in fact, according to several metrics, the EU is if not the leader in these technologies. So let's look into this. The first thing I want to say is how rapidly things have changed in the past few years. Of course, we've always had, we've had for a long time an interest in CCS. We've had a CCS directive for a while. We are well aware of carbon removal potential. We discussed that in our long-term strategy of 2018. But the real watershed moment, I would say, was probably the climate law in early 2020. So if you look just a few months before that, the European Green Deal did not mention removals, for instance. We mentioned 2050, the goal for neutrality. But it's really the climate law that brought the after 2050 and the concept of negative emissions really at the forefront, and in fact made it a mandatory objective for the EU. As far as I recall, this was in fact a demand from the European Parliament, which the Commission could live with, and the European Council eventually accepted. And what's happened after the climate law is that in subsequent texts, so the Circular Economy Action Plan, the Farm to Fork Strategy, etc., we've basically explained and started to explain how we'll go about this, promoting CCU more and carbon removals. And the latest landmark text, I would say, in that regard is the Sustainable Carbon Cycles communication of late last year. So next slide, please. Right, so I'll start with a couple of principles that guide our action on these technologies, not always applying to the three of them, CCS, CCU, and removals, but there are a lot of overlaps. The first principle for us that's very important is that whatever we do on this sector must not distract from the mitigation efforts at source. It must also do no harm, so a principle we have across policies, to biodiversity in particular. So the sort of solutions we will sponsor and support are the ones that yield the most co-benefits, social co-benefits, but also for biodiversity. We do see carbon removals as a new business model, potentially, but for that, a key principle is credibility. And that's why we'll invest a lot on measuring, reporting, verification, as we've done in other policies. And the last principle, I suppose, is policy integration across the board. So the idea is that once we've understood better what's possible, we start integrating it to our existing instruments. The ETS directive, but also the Sustainable Products Initiative, the Construction Products Regulation, etc., etc. Click, thank you. Our priorities, if you want to list them in that order, is first to reduce fossil carbon use by 95% by 2050. And then only a second priority is to focus on the residual 5%. And for this 5%, favor recycling. So recycling carbon from waste, from sustainable biomass or the air. And then only can we go into full active carbon removals, which we acknowledged will become the main focus of action after climate neutrality is achieved. Click, please. Thank you. So the sequence is that, as far as the Commission is concerned. In the short term, identify solutions for carbon farming in particular, do what we can to foster and help the member states foster new industrial value chains for sustainable CCUS, and we definitely have a lot to learn from the UK on that regard. In the longer term, in the mid-term, develop enablers, and the key enabler here for us is an EU framework for the certification of carbon removals. That would be part of our regulatory framework that we want to table by the end of the year. And of course, the kind of demonstrators we support at the moment are also enablers, because we intend to learn from them. And in the longer term, the idea, as I explained, is to integrate carbon removals across our policy portfolio, especially post-2030. So next slide, please. So if I look at the Sustainable Carbon Cycles Communication, our last big text on these issues of last December, we insist a lot on carbon farming. We believe there is potentially a market for land users, land managers. We acknowledge there are several difficulties there and challenges. We also see a point in the bioeconomy. So I'm mostly talking about storing carbon in wood that is then reused in construction, in products. But perhaps most important for today is the focus on industrial capture, use, and storage of carbon. So our logic is quite similar to what we've heard from other countries. It's the idea of developing clusters on transportation and storage. But what we really insist on here is the open access, cross-border, and non-discriminatory nature of the market we want to create, backed by strong traceability and certification mechanisms. In the short term, we believe there are also things we can do with the existing CCS directive. I'll tell also a bit more about what we can do with ETS. We have a range of funding available for all stages of the life cycle of CCU, Horizon Europe, of course, but the Innovation Fund is probably the most important. The Innovation Fund is derived from the ETS. At a price of 75 euros per ton of carbon in the ETS, we estimate that the Innovation Fund could represent 38 billion euros between last year and 2030. So it's a massive instrument, and a lot of it will go to the topics we're discussing today. What we also see in conjunction to the Innovation Fund is that we not only support demonstrator projects, but the idea is that if we find the right regulatory framework, these projects could then sell some of their credits. So as long as we avoid double funding, that's another way of making these projects more long-term. We also allow some forms of state aid for these sort of projects. And of course, perhaps most relevant to neighbors of the EU, we have a Connecting Europe facility and projects of common interest through which we have funded and we are involved in projects beyond our borders. And somebody already mentioned the Northern Lights project. The key, as I explained, is that we see these projects, whether they're the ones funding from PCI, from Innovation Fund, as regulatory sandboxes. So we want to learn from their experience, and we also want to try some ideas on them. Next slide, please. Right, so the opportunities and challenges of storage in particular, I mean, many of them are valid across jurisdictions, but I want to focus a bit more on some of them that are specific to Europe, and including the UK. And the key first challenge is that there is a lot of theoretical storage in the EU and in Europe, but it's not evenly distributed. You can see, for instance, the strong potential of the UK and of Norway, as we know, and the more sparse potential in the rest of Europe. Next slide, please. The challenge is also the level of acceptance. Now, we have our own reading of the situation in different EU countries and non-EU countries, and it is true to say that not every EU member state is on the same wavelength on this. So some of them are opposed to storage, others not necessarily so. So a challenge of creating an open market will be to acknowledge these difficulties, but also to enable even those who have domestic issues with storing to still participate, and the industries in these countries to participate in our CCUS market. Next slide, please. So funding, I mentioned the Innovation Fund, it's potentially 38 billion euros. We've had a first wave of projects. They're about to go in line. The first one will be in about 2-3 years. What's interesting in the Innovation Fund, and that's actually what I was working on in Brussels before coming here. One of my roles was to follow from the Secretary General perspective at the Commission what's happening with the Innovation Fund. But we've really tried to learn from the past mistakes. So many of you will remember the NER 300 program that was about 10 years ago, where we tried and in fact failed to fund a lot of projects. I believe 13 or 14 eventually did not happen. The Innovation Fund is much simpler, is much more ready to use, if you like, for practitioners. There's been a strong effort to simplify the procedures, the level of overhead, of controls, of feedback. And the idea is to, once we fund demonstrator projects, to make sure that they don't find themselves questioning what's happening in 3 years, that there's funding almost all along. Next slide, please. So this morning, the Commission has announced the winners of the second call for the Innovation Fund. So we're talking 1.8 billion euros in 17 large-scale innovative clean tech projects. That's about half of them actually have a carbon removals or CCUS dimension. Not all of them. Some of them, for instance, are pure hydrogen projects. But many of them are. And I invite you, if you've not followed the news just yet, that was announced two hours ago, to check out our press release and the presentation of each of these projects. Next slide, please. So a few words as well on what we're doing on CCUS in the current negotiations on Fit for 55 package. I would not enter into the detail of the negotiations. The Parliament has expressed its position in the past months, the Council as well. We still have a few texts that must go before Parliament and Council. I'm talking about the Renewable Energy Directive. So I wouldn't comment on the position of others, but more on what we as the Commission have proposed. And a few things to observe. First is that our modeling for this package is the one to date that acknowledges the role of CCUS and carbon removals the most, more than we've ever did before. We have a couple of solutions, relatively short-term solutions for the Renewable Energy Directive that we've proposed, also to generate a market for sustainable fuels made of captured carbon in refuel aviation, in Fuel EU Maritime. And we also have proposed to further acknowledge the potential of CCU in the EU ETS directive, including non-pipeline transport. Next slide, please. So the next step for us, next steps in CCUS, we'll have another PCI list by the end of next year. Storage of CO2 will be considered a potential project of common interest. We'll launch a variety of studies on transportation and storage, because this is where we see the bottleneck, as I hinted at. And we'll also come up next year with a vision document, elaborating a bit more on these clusters. And here again, a lot to learn from how the UK is doing it. CCUS is starting to feature, not just yet, thank you. CCUS is featuring in our external energy strategy, and stakeholders will have several opportunities to get involved. We had a successful CCUS forum last year in October, I believe, and the idea is to make this annual. So I don't have the date for the next one, but we hope this will be the big meeting of experts wanting to get involved in the EU thinking on CCUS. Next slide, please. I'm almost finished. And I'd like to finish on perhaps the biggest announcement in this December 2021 paper, the notion of a regulatory framework for carbon dioxide removal. We acknowledge that any future policy choice will have to be sound and credible. And for this, we need reliable definitions and guarantees in terms of environmental integrity. That's valid for removals. Typically, we do not want double accounting. We do not want projects that harm biodiversity. That's also valid for CCS and CCUS. And the type of guarantees we're talking about is the duration of the storage. So these are the sort of things we must explore and that we intend to in fact, go beyond and certify. So we will propose an EU regulatory framework for certification of removals by the end of this year. The number of technical challenges is huge. We believe, though, that there are already a lot of existing solutions that can be extrapolated, including the agriculture world for removals. And typically, some of the experience we've had under the Common Agricultural Policy could be extended here. Of course, because we are in an international setting, a few words on what that means for our neighbors as well. beyond the fact that we've all agreed with what's happened in COP26 and the negotiation on Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, our line is clear that we first want to focus internally on developing our framework, and then we will see how that plays out with our neighbors. We're not necessarily in a rush to accept what's happening outside our borders and to immediately go into these projects beyond some of these we funded already. Our top priority is to develop our own regulatory framework, which we can then use as a benchmark, if you like, for collaboration abroad. That's the kind of logic we've used, on another hot topic recently, CBAM, where we have taken years to develop our ETS, and that gives us a solid base to then move on internationally and compare with imports. I have one last slide, I believe. Right, so another opportunity for you to get involved, that's something we published last Thursday. There is a call for experts who are able to advise the Commission on carbon removals, on all these questions we discussed, on technical barriers, on the international dimension. There's a link here, and the deadline to apply is 15 September 2022. We'll recruit from a large pool, if you like. It's not only member states. If you are a non-member state expert, you can also apply. The thing, of course, is that your potential conflicts of interest will be screened. I believe that was my last slide. Yes, thank you very much.
Emilian, thank you so much for that incredibly comprehensive slideshow, and also for that welcome call for potential expert advice. Delighted to see the EU sort of reaching out, and potentially anyone who's on this webinar who feels able to, please do get in contact, and I'm sure we can ensure that sort of those details about the application are sent around to everyone. We've now got we're just under sort of half an hour of a sort of public chat question Q&A available for our speakers. I recognise, Emilian, that you've mentioned, obviously, sort of in terms of your own expertise, you're not here as a CCUS sort of expert. You're here to present sort of the wider sort of EU view. So there are sort of a number of EU-related questions which I might sort of pose, but equally, please don't feel under any obligation to be able to answer them. I recognise, that sort of it may be that we have to sort of come back to some of those points. There are a number of questions actually from Brad's presentation, if it was okay just to sort of raise some from the chat function. And then some of them are sort of relatively general, and just points around things you've said, Brad. So Damien Wood asks, is the geological storage in the US onshore, offshore, or both? And Rachel Fanch asks, does obtaining federal funding trigger NEPA for the funded project? Don't know whether you might be able to sort of direct the answers to those questions.
Yes, so taking the first question, at this point, all geologic storage in the United States is onshore. It is principally in existing oil and gas fields. We do have one large-scale million-ton annually storage project in a saline reservoir that's been permitted. That's in Illinois. The infrastructure bill, however, prioritizes the development of offshore storage. We have a long ways to go compared to where you are in Northern Europe, especially thanks to the leadership of the Norwegians in the UK. But we also have a long-standing offshore oil and gas industry in the Gulf of Mexico. So it probably first and foremost is we have to do the regulatory work of developing the permitting for those offshore storage sites. The infrastructure bill is requiring that, and our U.S. Department of Interior is the place where that is being done, and we're working with them in an interagency fashion to support their efforts. There's enormous interest in offshore storage, especially on the Gulf Coast of the United States, Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi. But then we also have regions of the country where onshore storage is more challenging. So if you think about New England and the mid-Atlantic states in the Northeast, that's an area where offshore storage will be critical if carbon management is to make a significant contribution to meeting our climate goals. The second question was whether federal funding in the context of such as our infrastructure bill, but Department of Energy funding for a project triggers our National Environmental Policy Act, which for those who don't know, NEPA as it's called, is the legislation governing environmental impact assessments? And the answer is yes, it does. And it just depends on the nature of the project. It may require a full-fledged environmental impact assessment. Sometimes, depending on the project, you can get a determination of no significant impact, but either way, that is required as part of the process for getting federal funding from the Department of Energy for a carbon capture project or a CO2 transport or storage project in this instance.
Thank you, Brad. And if I can come back actually on another specific point to you with regards to US CCUS programs. Vedant Sina asks, does the funding contract from the DOE for pre-feed, feed and demonstration of CCUS projects come with either contingencies or clauses for meeting any developmental milestones over set deadlines to ensure there's no delay in projects from the original construction times? Do you have a sort of gateway sort of pipeline development program where, like with any sort of R&D, potentially you might have to turn off the tap if projects are delayed or are demonstratively not going to work?
Yes, in some cases milestones, in some cases actual requirements. For example, we have two different permitting pathways for geologic storage. If you're storing your CO2 in an oil and gas field in the context of enhanced oil recovery, that is one permitting approach. If you're storing the CO2 in what we call dedicated geologic storage, where there's no hydrocarbon production, which of course is what we're emphasizing going forward in the United States for climate reasons, that is a different permitting process. In either case, in certain funding streams from the Department of Energy for carbon management, you have to show that you have filed your particular permit applications and also meet milestones such as drilling test wells and ultimately the wells you use for injection for geologic storage. And that will be part of the ongoing evaluation for subsequent funding. It varies a bit from provision to provision, but yes, we do have those requirements. I would also say that when it comes to things like regulation and permitting, the challenges are often go beyond what the project developer is doing. So it also is the actions of agencies. And in the United States, we have a very federal system. So states are important, state permitting. And so our Office of Fossil Energy and Carbon Management, we're intensively engaged with the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency at the federal level and with U.S. states cooperating on permitting and trying to make sure that the permitting processes are efficient and timely to support commercial project development.
Thank you very much. I've got a question from Harshang Shah, which Harshang, I might get you to come in and ask yourself actually regarding ongoing programs or schemes which support new business models. Did you want to sort of elaborate on that?
Yes, it was for European Union, maybe for Emilian, and I saw that he mentioned about supporting new business models. So wanted to know about those ongoing schemes and projects. And I guess he answered in his deck of slides that there is a funding, innovation funding. Maybe that would be the
Yeah, so thank you, Harshang, for the question. Yes, I mean, there's a variety of support schemes, at least in the EU, whether we're talking CCU or carbon removals across different sectors. That's, I suppose, one of our strengths is to be able, through different funding sources, to capture the whole life cycle, from the very early research to shouldering risks for the industry. That's what the Innovation Fund is doing, to then helping complement that and turn it into profitable businesses. I mean, the list would be very long, but of course, if you have specific areas of interest, I'm happy to connect you with the experts.
For sure. Thanks.
I think this is a question potentially either both Emilian and Brad, but Walter Giappioni asks, why not make CO2 from bio origin, like off gas from biomethane processing, eligible for ETS carbon credits in the EU. So actually, it is a sort of more related EU question, but I guess it sort of relates more broadly to looking at this issue around biomethane and bioorigin for carbon removals. And I think, Emilian, you touched upon sort of potential carbon from waste. I didn't know whether there's any sort of, you set out a timeline for where the EU has sort of developed its strategies. Is there any additional work that you think might come on stream, or is now the sort of program set in its current form for the foreseeable future, or is there any sort of future opportunities to look at sort of how this may develop?
Yeah, so to be honest, on this one, I'll be a bit short, in part because it is a live issue in the current negotiations on the revision of the ETS directive. This being said, I should say that we do not have a principal opposition to bioenergy CCS. In fact, it's probably one of the two main avenues we see as potentially working. But there are the sort of issues that we did discuss. Leakages is one of them. And that's the sort of thing we want to focus on through our certification work. Its exact place in the EU ETS, I would rather not comment just now, to be honest.
No, I fully understand. I think there is a more general question, which I'll turn to Brad and Emilian. You're welcome to. It doesn't involve process, as it were, which is from Esther Ho, which is around a question she often gets asked is when advocating for CCUS as a mitigation or transition option is around cost efficiency. Obviously, existing levers such as energy efficiency, or life cycle planning are easier to implement. And I was wondered if that was something that has been challenged both in the States or in the EU, obviously around a question of priorities. And we see that in the UK also, a strong challenge on carbon removals as well. This is money that is being spent, and could that money not be invested elsewhere in other projects? So I don't know whether, Brad, that's a live discussion, the 12 billion pounds you invested, whether there were sort of live debates around whether that should have gone elsewhere, in whether energy efficiency may be less relevant, but sort of other schemes where efficiency and cost efficiencies can be demonstrated more clearly. That question around innovation and putting your investment in innovation versus existing opportunities to decarbonize.
Let me take the very last part of your question first. In the context of the infrastructure bill, it hasn't been so much a point of debate because the overall investment in energy and climate in that legislation is $62 billion. And so carbon management is a substantial but not overwhelming component of that, roughly a fifth. Going back over the past 20 years, though, it has been a persistent theme in the debate in the United States. And especially an argument used by opponents of carbon management technologies is the cost. I would point out, though, that carbon management technologies, carbon capture, direct air capture, carbon utilization, are really the only climate essential technologies in the US context, at least, that are expected to justify themselves on a per ton basis. I would suspect it's a little different in the European Union because you have the ETS. And so people are looking very carefully at what things actually cost on a per ton basis. But in the United States, we have, if you actually look at the costs on a per ton basis of carbon capture with different technologies across industries, and then you overlay that with cost per ton of other types of critical low and zero carbon technologies, wind and solar, and other mitigation options, what you find is that those costs are across the spectrum, and carbon management is on that spectrum is not more or less expensive than other things. It really depends on the nature of the project, its location, the market, and the technology. So we have mandated programs in the United States for renewable energy, electric vehicles, and things like that, where the cost of per ton in some instances can be quite higher than carbon capture, and in other instances quite lower. And similarly, direct air capture, which is the most expensive technology on the spectrum, very expensive now, but could potentially very quickly be cheaper than some sustainable aviation fuels. And so I really think that we're not putting carbon management technologies from a cost standpoint on the same plane as we with other technologies. And I think if we look at all of them on a cost per ton for CO2 mitigated basis, it's a lot more complex than people realize.
Yeah, and I'd like to add to what Brad said. I mean, he's absolutely right, especially in the EU context where we have this question, of course. The ETS solves part of the question because to an extent it does allocate resources where they are most needed to the most efficient forms of abatement. But of course, it's not completely complete. I don't see a lot of criticism for the sort of funding we put in the Innovation Fund, for instance, because people realize that at some point you do need public funding to see if a project, if a demonstrator actually helps. And that's the kind of things that private funding alone cannot always manage. But I would also like to reiterate that our understanding of costs, our notion of costs is also a bit wider. We don't only look at the cost efficiency, but the cost on biodiversity, on the socioeconomic costs of these solutions. Voilà.
That's an excellent point. Can I just add something very quickly? The other thing that I completely missed and Emilian just addressed a little bit in his response is carbon management technologies in many instances allow existing energy and industrial production to be retooled for a net zero economy. And if, at least in the United States and in Europe, many of our high wage jobs are in these existing industries. And there's enormous economic and social value in preserving that jobs and asset base where we can, rather than transitioning away from it for climate reasons. And I think that's also often overlooked in terms of, it's an enormous societal value that if we're going to have sustained political support for climate policy between now and the middle of this century, then we have to pursue strategies that preserve that high wage jobs base and support the communities that depend on these existing industries.
Thank you very much. We have now, I think, a question. I think one of our co-chairs, now McDowell, had his hand raised. Now, do you want to come in? I see. Or was that just a? Pardon, just wanted to.
Thank you, Chris. That was actually just me clapping my hands at something that Brad said. But since you sort of tossed me the mic, I would like to ask Brad. Well, I've got sort of questions for everybody, but Brad, you mentioned the possibility of 45Q being increased to $85 for, I think, sale and aquifer storage later this year, perhaps. And I wondered if you'd be able to comment on that, and the possibility or probability of it becoming a direct pay option, or if it will remain a tax credit. And if I may, for Emilian, when you talk about mitigation deterrence and how the removals option needs to not sort of dissuade that, how do you quantify that? Thank you.
Well, good to see you, by the way. With the caveat that I'm in the executive branch and I am not in Congress and I'm not advocating for legislation. Right now, the question was on direct pay. Was there another part to the question on 45Q, or was it just about direct pay and the prospects?
Just the prospect, I think.
Yeah.
But
so unfortunately, it's looking like direct pay may not be part of the package. We don't know that yet. That's what we've been hearing. What direct pay means for those who are listening, normally with a tax credit, you offset a tax credit with taxable income, and not all companies have consistent annual taxable income to use to offset those tax credits, and therefore have to go to outside investors who take the tax credit in return for investing in their project. But they demand a margin to do that, at least in the US context. And that leads to an inefficiency in the value of the tax credit translating into actual project deployment. Direct pay would allow you to just claim the value of the tax credit as a company on your tax return, which would be much more efficient and provide more economic value flowing into these projects. But we don't know yet, but it's looks less likely that will be part of the package, but the higher dollar values and the 10-year time frame appear to still be in the negotiation.
Yeah, Niall, on your $1 million question, of course, it is the big question on how you determine that, especially in a non-Sovietic economy where the market has its role to play. I suppose the first element of reply is what I mentioned earlier, that essentially the more your economy is covered by an explicit carbon price, the less you have to ask yourself these questions. And that's where we are gradually going by revising the ETS, by creating a new ETS, separate ETS for road and buildings, so that hopefully the market has the instrument to allocate where it is needed, as long as you ensure, and that's our big focus now, the credibility of the system. So the whole work on the MRV that we've done under the ETS and we want to replicate in that new carbon removal sector. Well, I guess that's the answer. But there's also a political notion or a bit of a target setting exercise as well. If I look at the proposal to revise our land use and land use change and forest regulation, the Commission has proposed that we do set an objective of capturing I believe to reach 310 million tons CO2 equivalent per year by 2030. So it would be kind of the first time we set figures objective for carbon removals. And that's because our impact assessments have shown that in fact, our land sector is not a sink anymore. The sink is pierced, and there's something to restore there. But the European Parliament's Environment Committee wants that target to be 490. So at some point, there is likely to have to be, I wouldn't say arbitrary, but figures, carbon removal targets set by the authorities. We are not that big on it at the moment, beyond that one example from LULUCF.
I think I'm conscious also Mr. Bong Yong is still on the call, and I'm really grateful for you still listening in. I don't know whether it might be possible to ask sort of one question of yourself, Mr. Yong. In your presentation, you had a great map of where South Korea is looking to collaborate with a number of international countries. And the question was put sort of in the question box, which was around potential collaboration with the EU and Asia. And I wonder whether how South Korea decides to form its international collaborations, whether there was any opportunity for collaboration with any other Western countries or within the EU.
Yes, well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Axel. I'm also here from KCC US. I'm a manager working here. And I would like to first of all apologize about the change in circumstances from our organization's end. And well, just to answer the question, right now we're helping a lot of our partners here in Korea explore new opportunities to work with partners abroad. And we would say it's mainly just to find mutual benefits and lead through joint research opportunities. And I think one of the key words is just finding a comparative advantage. And as you can see, well, as you might know, Korea is quite a narrow and geologically not really suitable country for storage on land. And though, well, there has been preliminary assessments for maritime storage, there's still a lot of that can be done with cross-border CCS products with other countries. And this is the main road that we're exploring right now for continuing cooperation in CCUS.
Thank you very much. And in terms of, I guess, sort of South Korea's future role, I mean, it's been sort of touched upon in some of the questions around future models. Do you see any particular international partners, given sort of the maritime CCUS approach that you're taking, who would be particularly sort of well suited to working alongside for developing sort of mainstream CCUS applications for the future? You know, if there was any sort of priority areas geographically, as well as obviously what you were doing in South Korea.
I would say, well, as our director covered in the presentation, Australia is one current partner that also has a lot of willingness, not just from not just from the private sector, but also from government. So this is one of the opportunities that we're exploring the most for the moment.
Thank you very much. Amelia, now we're going to go to the private roundtable conversation with just the commissioners shortly. So I will sum up in a moment. There is, however, a sort of question, I think, around EU ETS credits. So Lee Elston asks, can you already get EU ETS credits for CCS or CCUS, or this won't be introduced until the EU ETS is revised? Question mark. Can you clarify when the EU ETS revision might take place?
Yeah, so well, I can clarify some main lines. I can't go too much into detail because negotiations are ongoing. So we had a first trialogue yesterday. That's when Parliament, Council and Commission sit around the table and start comparing their positions. The Parliament reached its position last month. The Council did 2 weeks ago, and the Commission, of course, operates on the basis of its original proposals. So we had a first trialogue yesterday. There should be a couple more, in fact, many more probably. And we hope to have the revision voted by the end of the year, if not early next year, under either the Czech or the Swedish presidencies of the Council. The ETS revision directive does not go alone, so it's part of the Fit for 55 package, and we'll also have to see how discussions progress on the other elements, in particular the CBAM proposal and the Social Climate Fund, because these three form a group, if you like. So, but I won't enter the detailed negotiations, but I can clarify some of the things the Commission did propose in the proposal for revision of ETS directive in relation to CCU. First, we've proposed to increase the size of the innovation fund. So this massive fund I mentioned that is derived from ETS allowances. We've proposed to include the possibility of carbon contracts for difference in the directive. We have also proposed to set a basis to avoid double counting of emissions when synthetic fuels based on CCU are produced and consumed in activities covered by the ETS. And finally, there will be an opportunity. We've proposed that there is an opportunity for allowances coming from permanently chemically binding carbon into products. So some form of CCU could warrant you extra allowances indeed.
Thank you very much, Emilian. And I thank both of us, all or three of our speakers, for really high quality presentations. I'm deeply grateful for the amount of work that's gone into the speeches and presentations you've given this afternoon. We're going to go in a moment to a private roundtable session, so our commissioners can sort of ask questions in Chatham House, allowing our speakers to be sort of give a bit more flexibility. But I wanted to let all the those who've been watching the webinar today know that our third webinar will be on the 25th of July at 1 to 3 p.m. And that will be looking at future directions of carbon capture and carbon removals. And we already have our first registered speaker, Galoran Turan, who's the General Manager of the Global CCS Institute. So if you would like to attend this third webinar as part of this series on carbon management, Francesco has just put the registration link into the chat box. We'd be delighted to see you and allow you to be able to ask your questions of the speakers once they're fully lined up on the 25th. Again, thank you very much for everyone who's been attending this open session, and we'll now move into a private roundtable session for the commissioners.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.